Hello, my name is Tom Willemain. I'm one of the co-founders of Smart Software and I'm in charge of the research operation. Today I want to give you a very light overview of some of the most common inventory control policies that our customers use. We'll talk about 3 today. There's a 4th which will be the subject of a separate little demo. The 3 are actually divided into 2 groups. There's one called a periodic review inventory policy, and there are 2 that are called continuous review inventory policies. And the continuous review, as you might expect from the name, says you're constantly keeping an eye on the inventory and looking to see whether it's dropped so low that you have to do something, you have to respond and restock. With the periodic review, you're not quite as vigilant. It's a simpler and probably less efficient solution, but for many companies it's easier to implement. And the periodic review policy says you let what's going to happen happen, and every now and then, periodically, like once a week or even once a month, you take stock of where your stock is and you decide about how to replenish. So those are the 3 we're talking about today. The 4th one is called MRP logic, or forecast-based inventory planning, and that involves a larger time horizon. The 3 we're talking about today are in one form or another reactive to the random fluctuations in demand. So that's our subject matter. We're going to start by, as we always should, before we get into the technology details, why do we care about this? How does all this math and probability math figure into the business needs of the company? And basically there's a fundamental trade-off that every inventory professional has to wrestle with all the time. And that trade-off is a balance, finding a comfortable place to balance 2 opposing forces. One is the need to keep inventory levels low, and the other is to keep item availability high so that your customers get what they ask for when they ask for it. So let me draw a crude representation of that fundamental trade-off curve. So on the vertical axis, we'll put cost. And on the horizontal axis, we'll put item availability. And the dynamics of inventory policy force a kind of trade-off. If you freeze your policy, you're going to be someplace on this curve. And the curve ends up being very steep here. If you want to go to higher and higher levels of availability, you have to endure higher and higher levels of inventory investment, and therefore the cost of doing business. So we can imagine 3 places on this curve. There's A, B, and C. At point A, you're spending very little on the care and feeding of inventory. But you're also not doing very well by your customers because there might be a very high chance that you'll stock out when somebody wants something. And you'll have to either lose the business or back order. In either case, there aren't many happy faces when that happens on either side of the transaction. You could go to point B somehow, and we'll talk about how you would move from A to B. You could go to point B, and now you're enduring more cost, but you're doing better by your customers. And finally, you could go to point C, in which case you're getting increasing costs, but you're also making the items more and more available. And of course, at some point, there's 100% availability, and after a while, it kind of gets ridiculous to keep putting more money in because 99.999% is probably good enough for everybody. So your goal in managing an inventory policy, and even in choosing one, is to decide which curve you're on. And with certain technological improvements, you could actually shift the curve. So a better curve would be this one, where every level of availability is actually cheaper. That's a separate topic, but whatever you're doing now without changes, put you someplace on this curve. And most companies, unfortunately, don't think of both axes at the same time. There will be people, maybe the sales managers, who care a lot about availability because they want to be able to say yes to every customer who requests your product. And there are other people who just worry very much about cost, and there aren't enough people who understand that there's a balance between these, and the company has to think about both the cost and availability at the same time. Well, software today allows us to show where we are on that curve and to give us a method, for instance, to move this way or this way depending on our corporate strategy. So let's look at the first of the inventory control policies, which is the periodic review policy. And let's make a picture of the dynamics, the day-to-day dynamics of your inventory on hand. So the picture has a vertical and horizontal axis. This axis is time, and we might say that it means which day it is. So we're going day to day. And on this axis, the vertical axis, we'll have on-hand inventory. And the definition of periodic review says you need two numbers to specify which flavor of periodic review you're doing. Those two numbers are called parameters. You can think of them as knobs that you can adjust to tune the policy. So these periodic review policies have, the first is what's the period of the periodic review. That is, how often do you check your inventory and decide how to react to what you find. So it's periodic. So periodically, say let's say at 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and so forth, you will decide what to do next. So that's one of the parameters. And this is called a TS policy. So in this case, the T is 30, the time between checks of your inventory. And the S is called the order up to level. We put that here. And the idea is you try, when you replenish, to get back up to the order up to level. And that can be, the T could be smaller or longer. You could look every week instead of every month. And the order up to level could be lower or higher. So let's see how the inventory would play out as days go by. And maybe we'll use red here to illustrate. Let's suppose we start out at time 0, like now, and we have an amount equal to the order up to level, which might be, let's say, 30 units. Now, with each passing day, demand will come in at random times and in random quantities. And especially if you're dealing with a thorny problem called intermittent demand, which is true of spare parts, for instance, the demand is very unpredictable. And a lot of times it's 0. So for instance, we might go through several days where nothing happens here. The demand just sits. The supply just sits where it is. And then all of a sudden you get an order for a bunch. So the on-hand inventory drops. And you'll proceed in this way. There might be a large order here, and then it's quiet. And then you get to the first interval where you say, okay, where are we? And you find that this is the inventory level at 30 days. And there's a gap. There's a gap between where you are now and the order up to level. So that's your order quantity. You order that much more. So you cut that purchase order, it goes out to a supplier, and sometime later, unfortunately, it comes in. And so there's a lead time after which that will show up. But in the meantime, life goes on and demand continues to trickle in. So you might be quiet for a while, and then there'll be more demand coming in, and you drop to here. And at this point, the lead time has expired, and this amount comes in from your supplier. So your on hand goes up by this much, and maybe it puts you there. So you haven't really got to your order up to level because in the meantime, your stock has been depleted by continuing demand during the lead time. So you get up to here, and the cycle continues. You may have a very quiet rest of the month where nothing is ordered, and that's your on hand at the second period, 60 days, and you have a fairly small gap here, so you order that much, and after the lead time, maybe you have a flurry of demand that's taking you down to here, and now you get this little bit more, and that's where you are at that point, and this cycle continues where you've got a certain gap which you order, which comes in later, and in the meantime your inventory is dropping, and then you order this much, and this goes on and on. So that's the way the dynamics work out, and this is the way the mechanics of the periodic review system work. Every certain number of days you look at where you are, see the gap between where you are and your order up to level. You order that, there's a lead time, it comes in later, and this fluctuates up and down. So that gives you what's called a trace of the item stock level. From a picture like this, you can derive your critical or key performance indicators. For instance, one of them would be the average inventory investment. How much on average, on an average day, do you have in stock? If you multiply that by the price of the item, you see how much money you've had sitting on the shelf, tied up in inventory, instead of, for instance, giving you a bonus. How much that inventory is, how much money is tied up in inventory on an average day. And so if you look at this red curve, and it's fluctuating over time, there's an average level. We'll draw that in green, and maybe we say this is the average inventory. So that can be used to figure out the cost of your investment in inventory. Another performance measure is how much does it cost to do the reordering. Well, in this particular case, you know that you've got every 30 days you make an order, so there's no randomness to that at all. There'll be 12 orders in a year. And so however much it costs you to cut a purchase order, that times 12 is going to be the cost of replenishment. Now, what's the holding cost? You have to have care and feeding of the inventory. It has to be kept on a shelf, protected from the elements, protected from theft. You pay taxes on your warehouse. All that stuff goes into holding cost. So the holding cost would again be related to the average inventory. And typically a company might say, or figure out that their holding cost is a certain percentage of the dollar value on the shelf. So maybe 10% of the dollar value is what it costs you to keep the inventory in storage. So you can figure out from this kind of picture two of the three cost components, the holding cost and the ordering cost. You're also getting the inventory investment. And the final performance metric is, what's your stock out risk? What sort of service level do you have? And if we look at this picture, we've gone through 3 cycles where there was never a stock out. So the stock out probability is 0, and the fill rate is 100%, at least for these 3 months. But if this red line you happen to have a very busy time, and you went down here, then all this is going to be stuff you could not supply when asked. So this picture can also show you the third component of inventory operating cost, which is the shortage cost. And you have to think about what does it mean when we can't immediately provide the item that's requested. If you're operating under what's called a loss policy, then it's just gone. Somebody else gets the business. So if you're selling a $100 item and you can't provide it, then you've lost the $100. But that may happen rarely, so you look at what fraction of the demand was lost and multiply that by the $100, and that tells you how much money you've lost as shortage costs during a year. And you can add that to the holding cost and the ordering cost to get a total cost of operating the inventory. And that's that vertical axis on the trade-off curve. That's the cost side. And on the horizontal axis, and that fundamental trade-off, is the availability. And it's this sort of thing that tells you your availability. So this sort of dynamics can be analyzed. This can be simulated in a computer. If we have a model of demand, we can show you scenarios of this red line. And in a different month, of course, you'll have different red lines because demand will unfold at random. But if you do that a couple of thousand times, you get a pretty good idea of what's going to happen if you choose a certain T and a certain S. And then you can decide, what if I change T? Or what's easier is, what if I change S? How will that shift me on the cost curve? So that's how you can go from this kind of detailed analysis of the day-to-day level of inventory and get an idea of where you are on the cost curve. And then you can do what's called what-if analysis. What if we changed S from, say, 30 to 25? What do we gain? What do we lose? We'll have less inventory, so we gain on holding cost. We'll probably have more stockouts, so we lose on availability, and we would shift down and to the left on that curve. And maybe that's what we can tolerate these days. And maybe someday we can go back to the right. But for now, we may be in a pinch, and we may want to drop S from 30 to 25. And we can see what happens instead of guessing at what happens. We can see how both the costs and the availability change. And that's the key virtue of doing the analysis. It shows you what your trade-off curve is, and if you decide to change your policy, it'll show you where you're going to move on it. So that is what we've just said here is going to be true of the other two continuous review policies, but that all work the same way. We have a slightly different picture. So the next step is to show how the other two policies play out this way. So now we look at the second of the three policies, and the second and third are a little bit different from the first, because the first had that periodic review. You didn't have to keep your eye on the inventory all the time, but actually that policy is less efficient just because you're less vigilant. So you could be more efficient if you switch to one of these other two. And the first of the two we're going to look at is the so-called QR policy. This has the two knobs. Q stands for the order quantity, and R is a reorder point. And this one works differently. The essential difference is you keep your eye on the inventory, and as it drops and drops and drops as demand comes in, it'll hit a red line called the reorder point. And at that point, whenever that is, could be 2 days from now, could be 30 days from now. Whenever that happens, then you order more, and the amount you order more isn't random like it was last time. Remember, with the periodic review, you had to, wherever you started, which was a random point, you tried to get back up to the order up to level, and that varied. Here, the order quantity is always a fixed number. It might be order 10. So the rule might be a reorder point of 5. When your inventory gets down to 5 units on the shelf, then you order 10 more, order quantity 10. And let's look at how that would play out over time. So we have the same sort of picture where this might be the day, and this is the on-hand inventory. And now we have a reorder point. That's the critical line. And we might start, say, here at R plus Q. So this, let's pretend this is our initial level. And as time goes on, demand comes in, and maybe we get a large order, and we actually bust through the reorder point, and we come below it. So at this point, at this time, we have to order more. And how much do we order? We order whatever Q is. So that's a fixed amount. And it looks like from this picture that this is Q. So we're going to order this much more, but when will it come in? Again, there's a lead time. So demand is going to continue to happen. And then at some point, the replenishment arrives. And we go up by this much. So now we're here. So now we're pretty close to the reorder point. So we could get an immediate big order, and bang, we're ready to order again. So we have to order more. And again, there'll be a lead time delay. And in the meantime, we could be getting more demand, and then we'll get a replenishment. And at this point, we're sort of dancing back and forth between frequent reorders because the demand is sort of maybe too high for our choice. But it could be that time goes on and it's very intermittent demand and you get a dry spell and nothing happens. And then maybe here you have to order again. And maybe now there's a torrent of demand and you actually go negative, and you might be in a situation where you get up to here and you're still underwater and you have to order immediately. So this situation isn't necessarily, this example looks kind of pathetic because you're in trouble all the time. It doesn't have to work out that way. But I wanted to illustrate that there is this possibility of going negative. Or if you have a loss policy, you can't go negative, you just stay here. And in which case, you'd add in a certain amount and you get back up above the reorder point. But the same sort of picture applies as it did with the periodic review. This is your on-hand inventory over time, and you can use this graph to decide, say, what's your over a year or even 2 years of simulated operation, what your average on hand is. From that you can get the inventory investment, how many dollars are tied up on the shelf. You can get the holding cost, which is often just approximated as, say, 10% of the average. You can get the order cost, because here's an order, whenever you come down, here's an order, here's an order. So there's a random time between orders now, but you can count up how many orders you have in a simulated year and turn that into dollars. Some of our customers have very adept accounting departments, and they can tell the planners immediately. There was one in England that said, oh yes, if we order it's 30 pounds, 30 British pounds. To cut another purchase order. They just knew it off the tip of their tongue. So you get the order cost, and then you can look at the frequency of these outages where you go negative, and from that you can derive the shortage cost, and you add those together, and that gives you your total operating cost. So if you go back to our fundamental trade-off curve, where we have availability and cost, you can see where you are on that curve. And if you try different policies, you can basically discover what the curve is by saying, let's change R, let's change Q. It'll move your place. And then you could figure out where this curve is. And then management earn their pay by deciding what's the proper balance between customer service and our internal cost of providing the customer service. And they might say, this is where we should be operating, at least for now. And you can derive from your experience with the analysis what pair of R and Q values get you there. So that's how we would analyze the second of the three policies, which is a continuous review with a reorder point and an order quantity. And the next is the final of the three, which is going to be what's called a min-max policy. And now we'll finish up and very quickly show the third of the three inventory policies that are reactive to where your on-hand inventory is. And this is called the min-max policy. And it has theoretical advantages over the other two because it's more adaptive, more agile than the others. And so it's a very common policy. It's a smart thing to do if you can pull it off. So we'll make the same sort of picture of the dynamics of inventory versus time, and we'll just show how it's different in one detail. And that detail is how much you order. With the RQ, there was a reorder point and a fixed order quantity. With the min-max system, the min is the same as the reorder point. There's a fixed level at which you go ahead and order more. The difference is, instead of having a fixed number, like ordering 15 units every time, you have a random number, which is like the first policy, where you try to order up to a maximum level. So it's a kind of a composite of the first one and the second one. So we'll draw the picture again of daily operations. Here we have the on-hand inventory as a function of time, and there is a kind of a red line here which is now called the min, and we have now something up here called the max. So you can see we had a line like this with the periodic review, and we had a line like this for the second, the RQ system. So let's imagine we start off at the top. And again, randomly, demand will arrive and push us down. Maybe there's a large order, maybe it's quiet, then we get another large order. And at this point, we've crossed the min, so that's our signal to get more. And again, there's going to be a lead time, so there'll be some lead time before that replenishment arrives. But in the meantime, we will still continue to have demand of some random intervals and random quantities. Let's say it looks like that. Now we get a replenishment, but how much did we order? We were here. We want to get to the max. So we would be ordering this much to fill in that gap. So this much would come in at this point, and we go up to here. Now we don't quite get up to the max again because in the meantime our pocket has been picked by the continuing demand. But this will continue to go along like this, and maybe we have some big demands and we end up in negative territory. At this point, when we went through, we say, well, we need that much, so after a lead time, that much will come in, and we get back here above the max, and we continue on. So the only essential difference is when we hit the reorder point, which is now called the min, we try to get back up to the max. So we have a random order quantity at each period. And again, the same logic applies. You can use the software to simulate, say, a year or 100 years of operation with a choice. Maybe you say max equals 50 and min equals 15, and you see what happens. What does that imply for holding cost, for ordering cost, for shortage cost? And if you add those together, you get the total operating cost of that policy with these choices. And you also have some idea of how often you end up stocking out, and that goes to the availability. So you get back on your universal trade-off curve of cost and availability, and you've seen that if the min is 15 and the max is 50, that's where you are. You can look again at, say, a max of 60, and you'll move to another place. It'll probably be more expensive, but more availability, 70, and so forth. And you can sketch out this curve, And then management has to make a judgment about what's a comfortable, a tolerable place to be, because you're sort of drawn and quartered, you're being pulled toward availability and pushed away from cost, and you find a balance point that at least temporarily, maybe for this quarter, serves the company well. So that's the way modern computer software for supply chain analytics can look at a demand history of an item and figure out, if you manage it in a certain way, one of these three choices with two values set in the knobs, the parameters, what's going to happen? You don't have to guess, and you've got the information you need to make an informed management decision about what to do next. And it all is built on a model of the demand process. And complications are possible. For instance, we've always shown these lead times as if they were fixed. The lead time itself can be random. And our operational analytics software can look at your ordering history from all of your suppliers and give you a picture of what that randomness is. Maybe they usually give you a response in 14 days, but sometimes it's 25 days, and once they did it with 10 days, you can take that randomness in account too. So the demand randomness and the supply randomness can all be incorporated in the analysis, and you end up not having to guess, but understanding where you are now and how things will get better or worse if you make certain changes in the way you manage the inventory. So I hope this has clarified some of the basic dynamics of day-to-day inventory and how we can use those dynamics to lead to better business decisions. And I hope to see you again when we talk about more such topics. Thanks.